Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a small American town where every house had its story, there stood an old wooden cottage, fragile but proud, that seemed to defy time. It was the home of Henry Thompson, 82 years old, a humble, discreet man, whose entire life had been woven within these walls. His memories, his joys, his sorrows and his family laughter were anchored there. But a few streets away, a young millionaire named Richard Bennett, ambitious and arrogant, saw in this modest home an opportunity to demolish the house to build a modern complex. For Richard, Henry was only a minor obstacle, a detail in the path of his fortune. The old cottage wasn't just a building for Henry, it was the last tangible link to his past, a refuge laden with memories. And when Richard Bennett gave the order to bring in the bulldozers, no one suspected that the destruction of a simple cottage would awaken a storm of memories, emotions, and unexpected confrontations. The morning was bright, but for Henry Thompson, the sun carried no warmth. A black van pulled up in front of his house, and two men in suits got out, carrying thick folders. They had come on behalf of Richard Bennett, the young millionaire who had recently made his fortune in real estate. "Mr. Thompson, you must sell your house immediately," one of them said, his tone sharp, as if every word were an order. "Otherwise, legal action will be taken." Henry rested his wrinkled hands on the porch railing. His eyes, full of fatigue and memories, rested on his house. Every wooden plank, every window, every crack told a story of his life. He took a deep breath. I can't sell," he said softly but firmly. "This house is all I have left." The man frowned. "It's your choice, Mr. Thompson. But be aware that Mr. Bennett does not tolerate obstacles." Henry felt a pang of worry, but he remained motionless. He knew his resistance would not be enough against Richard's money and power. Yet his attachment to this house was stronger than fear. A few days later, the roar of bulldozers echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, crowded behind hedges and fences. Henry stepped outside, trembling, his eyes fixed on his house, now besieged by machines ready to crush everything. He tried to speak, to beg, but the roar of the engine and the impact of the machinery crushed his words. Henry looked one last time at his front door, at his favorite window where he had hung childhood mementos, photos of his parents and his missing brother. Everything was about to disappear under the merciless blows of the bulldozers. And as the first planks gave way, Henry felt an emptiness settle in his chest. It wasn't just his house that was falling, it was his whole life, his memories, his memory. Yet, in a corner of the rubble, a flash of color caught his eye. An image from his past seemed to be waiting for him. The roar of the bulldozers had ceased, leaving behind a heavy, almost unreal silence. The house of Henry Thompson was nothing more than a pile of broken planks, splintered bricks, and scattered memories. The old man moved slowly through the rubble, his trembling hands brushing against the pieces of wood and shards of glass. Each step seemed to awaken a memory, his brother's laughter in the living room, birthday parties in the kitchen, quiet mornings spent on the porch. The neighbors watched in silence, some murmuring words of sympathy, others shaking their heads at the injustice. Henry paid them no attention. His eyes were fixed on the ground, scrutinizing every piece of debris as if the house itself were speaking to him. Suddenly, a shard caught his attention. Half buried beneath a broken beam, a photograph, yellowed by time, barely protruded. Henry knelt down, dust covering his trembling hands. He took it gently, as if touching the fragile object could preserve his memories. His eyes widened when he recognized the image. It was him, a child, sitting in the garden of this very house, his smile bright, his cheeks round, and his eyes shining. Beside him, his parents, tender and smiling, seemed to be watching over him. The photograph captured a simple, pure, innocent moment. Henry felt a lump form in his throat. Tears welled up, but he held them back. Every wrinkle on his face now told a story, an entire life enclosed in a single piece of paper. This memory, forgotten for decades, had just reminded him that the house wasn't just a building, it was the heart of his life. Richard Bennett, who arrived a few moments later to inspect his work, observed Henry. He expected to see anger, fear, perhaps submission. But what he saw froze him. Henry, fragile yet standing, holding the photograph like an invincible treasure. An eerie silence fell between them. For the first time, Richard felt that money and power might not be enough to crush this old man and his memories. And as Henry looked up at him, a glimmer of defiance, history, and dignity crossed his eyes. Henry stood motionless, holding the child's photograph to his chest like a talisman. The light wind stirred debris around him, and each piece of broken wood seemed to whisper lost memories. The neighbors, silent but attentive, watched the scene, some hiding their outrage behind trembling hands. Richard Bennett, for his part, felt an unusual unease. He had never encountered human vulnerability in this way. Money, power, and contracts could not buy what Henry possessed, a lifetime of memories. "It's just an old photo," Richard said, trying to break the silence. But his voice betrayed a nervousness he'd never known. Henry looked up, his eyes wet but determined. "This photo is my life. These walls, these planks, every stone in this house, it was my world. You can't understand what it means to be uprooted from your own memory." Richard looked away, something cold and calculating inside him beginning to crack. He hadn't expected to feel this guilty. But the anger and outrage of the surrounding community was palpable. The neighbors' murmurs turned into audible questions. How could anyone do this to an old man? Suddenly, a young neighbor, Tommy Jenkins, stepped forward and said in a firm voice, "You destroyed his home, Mr. Bennett. But you cannot erase his past. And we will not remain silent." Henry gently placed the photo on an undamaged piece of board, as if to protect it from the wind and dust. He stood tall, despite the collapse of his house. Richard felt the weight of every glance he received. This was no longer a simple property dispute, it was a question of dignity, memory, and respect. For the first time, Richard understood that money wasn't everything. He hadn't just destroyed a house, he'd damaged an entire life, a history, an irreplaceable past. And something inside him began to change, if only slightly. Richard Bennett stood a few meters away, staring at Henry with a mixture of frustration and incomprehension. He had always believed that money could solve everything, that power was enough to impose his decisions. But facing this old man and his determined gaze, he felt for the first time an unease he could neither buy nor ignore. Around them, neighbors began to approach. Some had taken out their phones to film the scene, others were talking among themselves, their tone oscillating between anger and solidarity. The voice of Tommy Jenkins, young and fearless, echoed, "You can't do this to an old man. Not here." Henry, still holding the childhood photo against him, slowly raised his hand to quiet the whispers. His voice, shaky but clear, spoke to Richard. "Do you see this picture? It's my life, my whole life. You can tear down the house, but you can't erase what I've been through. You can't erase my past." A heavy silence fell. Even Richard, who was used to commanding and intimidating, felt the weight of these words. He looked away for a moment, unable to respond. The feeling of discomfort intensified when several neighbors began to approach closer, forming a protective circle around Henry. "You think your money makes you great," an older neighbor whispered. "But it can't buy respect. And here in our community, you're going to have to answer for yourself." Richard, for the first time, felt like an outsider. His contracts, his successes, his millionaire status seemed insignificant compared to the dignity and memory of a man whom life had shaped with strength and courage. A shiver ran down his spine. For the first time, he understood that this confrontation was not just about his home, it was about values, memory, and human pride. Henry, still holding the photo, addressed the neighbors. Thank you for being there. Today, it's not just my house that's in ruins, but together we can show that respect and dignity are stronger than arrogance and money." Richard's gaze met Henry's. And in the tense silence, he felt the first crack in his arrogance. The days following the demolition were far from calm. News of Henry's house's destruction spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors, outraged by Richard Bennett's arrogance, began to organize. Some offered to help Henry clean up the rubble, while others discussed the possibility of rebuilding his house themselves. Henry, still fragile but driven by an inner resilience, refused to be a mere symbol. He wanted to tell his story, to show that behind every destroyed house lies a life, memories, and a legacy. One morning, a young local journalist, Emily Carter, knocked on her door. She had heard about the incident and wanted to cover the story. Emily, curious and determined, asked Henry to tell her about his life in this house. With emotion, Henry explained how every corner of his house was linked to his childhood, the loss of his parents, moments of happiness and sorrow. Emily took photographs of Henry holding his childhood photo among the ruins. She noted his words, the old man's shaky but steady voice, and the reactions of the neighbors who had gathered to support him. Her article was quickly published, and the images reached hundreds of people in the town. Local social media went viral. Henry's story became a symbol of resistance to arrogance and greed. Richard Bennett, upon learning of the story's spread, felt for the first time that his reputation and image were threatened. The curious and indignant looks of the townspeople turned into public criticism, and the pressure on him mounted. He realized that his money and power were not enough to control this situation. Henry, meanwhile, remained amidst the rubble, but he was no longer alone. The community, moved and united, had rallied around him. It was no longer just a question of house or money, it was the dignity of an old man versus the arrogance of a young millionaire. And deep in his heart, Henry knew that this moment was just the beginning of an unexpected twist. The day after the article was published, Henry was surprised by the number of visitors who came to show their support. Neighbors with tools, young people with signs, and even families who had never spoken to Henry before came to help him rebuild the garden, clean up debris, and offer some comfort. Journalist Emily Carter proposed creating a series of portraits and videos to document Henry's life, so that his story could inspire other communities. Each photo, each testimony, heightened the emotion surrounding this humble but courageous old man. Meanwhile, Richard Bennett watched the situation from his luxurious office. His phone calls were going unanswered, and messages from outraged neighbors were pouring in. Even his associates were beginning to criticize him for his behavior, fearing that his reputation would suffer irreversible damage. An idea crossed his mind, to go there to confront Henry and try to control the situation. But when he arrived, he was struck by what he saw. Henry, surrounded by neighbors, was working to repair the garden and clear debris. The dignity and serenity of this old man were impressive. The journalists' cameras capturing every gesture made Richard even more aware of the public impact of his actions. Henry looked up at him and said calmly, "Mr. Bennett, you destroyed my home, but you did not destroy my life. Memory, recollections, and respect for others are stronger than your bulldozers." Richard, usually self-assured, felt unsettled. No contract, no amount of money could repair what he had caused or earn the respect of this community. Silence fell around him, interrupted only by the sound of neighbors working together and the flashing of cameras. For the first time, Richard understood that his wealth was only a tool, and that in the face of human dignity and collective support, he had no real power. Henry, still holding his childhood photo, seemed almost untouchable in his vulnerability. And deep inside, Richard felt an unexpected surge, shame, but also a budding curiosity about what respect and memory truly meant. In the days that followed, Richard Bennett could no longer ignore the magnitude of the situation. Emily Carter's articles had been shared throughout the city and beyond. Photos of Henry holding his childhood photo amidst the rubble circulated on social media, sparking an outpouring of emotion and solidarity. Even his business partners now criticized him for his arrogance, fearing that his reputation would be irreversibly tarnished. Richard, usually unflappable, found himself unable to sleep. Every memory of Henry's destroyed house came back to haunt his thoughts. He thought of the smiling child in the photograph, of the entire life encapsulated in that single piece of paper. He realized abruptly that he had not only demolished a house, but had trampled on a past, a memory, and a human dignity. One night, he found himself alone in his study, staring at the city lights, unable to find peace. He remembered Henry's words. Memories, and respect for others are stronger than your bulldozers. For the first time, Richard felt vulnerable in the presence of someone he had previously considered insignificant. He realized that his financial successes and investments had never built true respect. True greatness came from strength of character, dignity, and the memory of a life lived with honor. The next day, Richard returned to the site. This time, he wasn't there to assert his power. He watched Henry and the neighbors rebuild together, sharing smiles and stories. Every gesture, every word of the residents showed him what money couldn't buy: solidarity and respect. Henry looked up and saw Richard watching them silently. He said nothing, but his gaze, full of strength and patience, conveyed a clear message: true justice is not measured in dollars or contracts, but in humanity and memory. For Richard, this was a defining moment. He began to understand that redemption required more than rebuilding a house. He had to learn to recognize and respect the value of others, their history, and their dignity. Richard Bennett could no longer remain passive. After several days of introspection, he made a decision that surprised everyone: he wanted to right the wrong he had caused. But this time, he wanted to do it properly, with respect and humility. He returned to the scene, carrying tools and materials to help rebuild. The neighbors, initially suspicious, watched the gesture with astonishment. Henry, sitting on a chair among the rubble, watched him approach without showing anger, but with caution. Richard spoke to Henry, his voice trembling. "Mr. Thompson, I realize now that I made a huge mistake. I destroyed more than a home, I trampled on your memories and your life. I can't fix the past, but I want to help rebuild, with you and your community." Henry placed the childhood photo on a stable board and observed the young millionaire. After a long silence, he replied calmly, "Mistakes can be corrected if they are accompanied by respect and humility. If you are willing to learn, you are welcome." With the help of his neighbors, Richard began working side by side with Henry. He carried planks, cleared debris, and listened to stories of the old man's past life. Every gesture, every shared memory, reinforced in him the understanding that true wealth was not financial, but human. Emily Carter, the journalist, discreetly filmed this transformation. The entire town began to talk about this unexpected collaboration. The man who had destroyed the house and the old man he had confronted were rebuilding it together, in a symbolic gesture of redemption and solidarity. For Henry, this gesture did not completely repair the loss, but it brought a glimmer of hope. His story would be honored, and the community would show that dignity and respect are stronger than arrogance and greed. For Richard, this was the beginning of a profound transformation. He finally understood that true power lies in the ability to recognize one's mistakes and act with humanity. Weeks passed, and the house of Henry Thompson was beginning to rise from the ashes. The neighbors worked tirelessly, each contributing their stone. Laughter and conversation gradually replaced the heavy silence of the rubble. The house, carefully rebuilt, was both faithful to the original and enriched with new touches offered by the community. Richard Bennett still worked alongside Henry, but his role had changed. He was no longer the arrogant and distant man, but someone who listened, learned, and respected the stories that each plank and stone told. The old man guided him, recounting anecdotes from his childhood, parties spent in the garden, and the happy and sad moments that had shaped his life. One morning, as the sun rose over the neighborhood, Henry placed his childhood photo in a new frame and hung it on the wall of the restored living room. The smiling child's face seemed to watch over the entire house, reminding everyone that memories and emotions are the true foundation of a home. Neighbors gathered for a small ceremony. Emily Carter, present to document the moment, said, "Today we celebrate not only the rebuilding of a house, but the victory of dignity, memory, and solidarity over arrogance and greed." Henry smiled, surrounded by his community, and Richard, transformed by the experience. The house, much more than just a building, became a living symbol of a life story, a preserved past, and a united community. Richard, standing beside Henry, felt an emotion he had never known in his business or financial success: pride in having done good, in having learned humility, and finally respecting the history of others. For Henry, this rebuilt house was not just a home, but a sanctuary of memories and life lessons. And for Richard, It was the beginning of a new path, where material wealth gave way to human wealth and responsibility. The house of Henry Thompson was now completely rebuilt. New planks stood alongside restored memorabilia, and the childhood photo proudly stood in the center of the living room, a symbol of resilience and intact memory. The entire community celebrated not only the completion of the work, but the victory of dignity and solidarity over arrogance and greed. Richard Bennett, transformed by this experience, stood by Henry's side. He was no longer the arrogant young millionaire who thought money could buy everything. He had learned to listen, to respect, and to understand the value of memories and human life. Every smile he shared with Henry and every gesture from the community reminded him that true power lies in the ability to act with humility. Henry, meanwhile, looked around with profound calm. Neighbors, young and old, had gathered to share this moment with him, proving that solidarity and respect are forces more powerful than any bulldozer. He felt relief, but also immense gratitude. His history, his memories, and his home had been honored and protected. Emily Carter, the reporter, took one last photo, Henry holding his childhood photo, Richard by his side, and the neighbors smiling behind them. This image would become a symbol throughout the city, a reminder that memory, respect, and solidarity always trump arrogance and greed. Before leaving, Henry placed a hand on Richard's shoulder and said softly, "Money can buy buildings, but never respect, never memories, and never dignity. Always remember that." Richard nodded, moved, finally understanding the depth of this lesson. That day, he wasn't just leaving the house Henry had reclaimed, he was leaving his old arrogance behind to embrace a new understanding of what human richness truly means. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, Henry's house shone like a living shrine, a testament that even after destruction, memory and dignity can triumph.